All right.
This meeting is being recorded.
Okay. Good evening. I want to thank Ms. Elisheva Friedman for coordinating this wonderful series of shiurim. And this is being the first of a series of shiurim on a topic that I've had a chance, Baruch Hashem, to have written a sefer about and thought about for many years. And every time I go back to it, it's very exciting because you always find more angles and more interesting insights. And the specific area is the mitzvah, one of the most core mitzvahs of the Torah, which is mitzvah of Shabbos. We have it coming up in this week's parsha, Parshas Yisro. The Aseret Hadibros, of course, has the fourth of the 10 is the mitzvah of Shabbos, Yom HaShabbos HaKadsho. And what we'll try to do is understand the evolution of this mitzvah. And when I say the evolution of the mitzvah, I mean that we will soon see by the end of the shir today that the mitzvah of Shabbos actually preceded the giving of the Torah. We were first given mitzvah of Shabbos earlier, before Matan Torah, at two different junctures, and seemingly each of these junctures brought with it a mitzvah of the mitzvah of Shabbos, the idea that one should observe Shabbos. And then, of course, we get to Matan Torah, where Shabbos appears again. And the question really is, what changed, if anything, along the way? Why does the mitzvah have to be given again and again? And we try to understand it through the lens of different mefarshim and through the prism of midrashim and chazal. And there are many different layers of understanding this. And what we'll be able to do at the same time is really get insight into what Shabbos is all about. Not just in a halachic sense, but also in terms of its inner significance and its meaning, and many of the insights and lessons that we are to take away from Shabbos. And we'll see how different aspects of Shabbos can correlate with different points in history for Klal Yisrael. But before we talk about Shabbos before Matan Torah, what I'd like to do for maybe a while now is at least get us familiar with where we find the mitzvah of Shabbos throughout Chamisha Chumshei Torah. And I want to begin with our parsha, Parshas Yisro, and go from there until the end of the Chumash. And after we can get ourselves oriented in terms of being able to identify where the Torah speaks about the mitzvah of Shabbos, then we'll go backwards and see what about Shabbos before Matan Torah and begin to discuss maybe one of the approaches that can speak to this question as far as what was before Matan Torah and what was changing along the way. So I hope that everybody has a chumash, because what I'd like to do for the next little while is simply turn pages with you together and identify, if you don't all know already, where we will find the mitzvah of Shabbos appearing in Chumash. Some of these sources probably will be familiar, some might be less familiar, but hopefully now that we have it, once we go through it, it will stay with you and you'll be able to reference it as needed. Okay, so I'd like to start, as I noted before, with Parshas Yisro, which is the Aseret Hadibros. What we're going to do right now is not delve too deeply into the psukim themselves and all the different mefarshim. That we could do perhaps at a later time. But just to notice, at least on a surface level, what is mentioned with regard to Shabbos in the different places and contexts where you find it. So if we turn to Parshas Yisro, and I will, of course, reference Purakim and Psukim, although it's not my personal feeling that should be given too much credence, and I'll tell you why. Because the division of the Torah into chapters is not of Jewish origin. It actually goes back to the medieval period, and it was not done by Jews at all. It was done by Christians. And so a lot of times you see that it's quite arbitrary, and it almost seems very much illogical. Sometimes a parsha will end, and the last pasuk of the parsha will be a pasuk aleph of a new perek, like the end of Shemos, at the end of Parshas Chukas, at the end of Parshas Pinchas, which absolutely makes no sense. The pasuk is clearly connected to this section before it, and so the whole thing really is kind of arbitrary. But what can I do? You know, we have to try to reference things, and this is what even Klal Yisrael has sort of gotten accustomed to. unless you want to use Sheni, Shishi, Revi, Chamishi for the Aliyah. So I will use that as a way to get everybody to find the psukim. But again, I personally have a bit of an aversion to doing it. Okay, with that in mind, Parshas Yisro, Seres Adibros, Chaf, Ches, chapter 20, beginning with Psukim Ches, Tes, Yud, Yud Aleph. Okay, this is Shabbos in the Aseres Adibros. Zachor es Yom HaShabbos L'Kadisho. That is the way the Torah introduces it here in Yisro. That's the word Zachor. After this mentioning that we should remember Shabbos, this is of course the mitzvah as interpreted by Chazal of Kiddush. It also might have to do with remembering Shabbos during the week that we reference every day to the seventh day, Yom Rishon b'Shabbos, Yom Sheni b'Shabbos. You shall work for 6 days and finish your work. On the seventh day, Yom Hashvi Shabbos Hashem Elkecha, and here you have the Torah stating the negative, Lo Sasachol Melacha. It's not just the idea in the positive sense that we should rest, but the lav, it's a violation of a negative commandment not to do work, not just for you, but ato, bincha, bitecha, your son, your daughter, your servant, maidservant, and your animals, and the gerecha asher b'sharecha. Take note of that. What ger are we describing here? Typically, a ger who's a ger tzedek is fully Jewish, so then wouldn't need to have a separate warning that we should make sure the ger should not do malacha. Therefore, Chazal interpret this ger as something less than a ger tzedek, but what we call a ger toshav, which means he's not Jewish, but he's made certain commitments to abide by the Noachide code, the Sheva Mitzvah B'nai Noach, and we are to make sure that he doesn't do work for us on Shabbos. It doesn't mean that he is necessarily forbidden to do his own work. And that is, again, how Chazal interpret that phrase. And then you have the last pasuk, which is the rationale the Torah offers for the mitzvah Shabbos, because Hashem created the world, Shamayim v'Sa'aretz, over 6 days, the sea and all in it. Vayonach be'mashvi al kain beirach Hashem es yom Shabbos l'kadisheh. So these psukim give us a very good picture of the mitzvah Shabbos, both in terms of the positive idea of Zachor and in terms of the negative lo saseh involved, the lo saseh malacha, and various people who we are to see that they don't do work. And then the last pasuk being the idea of zecher l'maseh v'reishis. Okay, this is of course very, very central in Chumash. Let's move on. Go to Parshas Mishpatim. Here, not as lengthy a description, but a short mention of Shabbos, and you'll find this in Kapitel Chav Gimel, Pasuk Yud Beis. Now, the context here in Mishpatim is the Torah has many mitzvos in Mishpatim, as you well know. Parshas Mishpatim is a chock full of mitzvos. We get a little bit toward the end, approaching the ending of Mishpatim. So there are mitzvos connected to Shemitah. If you look in Pasuk Yud and Yud Aleph of that Perek Chav Gimel, you'll see mention of Shemitah. And then right after that, you'll see Pasuk Yud Beis, which states, as you see, Sheshes Yamim Tasa Ma'asecha, you shall do your work for 6 days, but Yom HaShvi Tishbos. So here you have the mitzvah put in the positive formulation, that you shall rest on the seventh day, and the Torah goes on, the pasuk continues, L'man yanuach shorcha b'chamurecha, so that your animal, you're specifically mentioning your ox and your donkey, shall rest. Now we did see the idea in Parshas Yisro that your animals should not do work for you. Lo sasacha melacha ato bin chetzes behemtecha. Here it says in the positive, and as the reason, you shall rest so that your animals shall rest, as well as the nafesh ben amascha vehager, and the son of your maidservant and the ger shall rest as well. And again, the idea of the ger being mentioned here, and Rashi again comments referring to a ger toshav. You should see to it that the ger should rest and not do work for you. That's the mention over here. Only one pasuk that gets mentioned in connection to a lot of other mitzvahs that come before and after, as Parshas Mishpatim, which describes the mitzvahs that were given after Matan Torah, after Aseres Adibros, and that's the extent of Parshas Mishpatim's mentioning of Shabbos. The next place that we go is to Parshas Kisisa. Parshas Kisisa actually mentions Shabbos more than once. Okay, the first time that it appears is toward the beginning, a little bit before Sheni. Again, Perek is Perek Lamed Aleph, and it's the very last section. And by the way, you'll see here one of those other examples of how sometimes you will have a strange division of chapters. Just so you notice for a second, you see that the Sheni ends after Pasuk Yud Zayin, and there's a Samach there, which means that it's a pause in the Sefer Torah and a break. And then comes the Pasuk, which is labeled Pasuk Yud Ches, which is going back to the story of the Chet HaEgel, that Hashem gave Moshe the first Luchos, and that's Pasuk Yud Ches. And right after that, you have the Pasuk of how the people are waiting for Moshe to come down, and they get nervous. So what happens? Whoever reason, they decide to break that up and end the Perek with Vayiten El Moshe, and start Perek Lamed Beis with Pasuk Lamed Aleph Vayar Ha'am. Clearly, that's not the way it should be. You see there's a break, and that break should have made the next Pasuk connect to what's afterwards. Okay, you see this all the time. Anyway, this last section, you have a number of things about Shabbos that would be very important to highlight, and we haven't seen it quite as striking as we have it here. So, Vayom Hashem Moshe Limar. Now, this pasuk appears after Truma and Tetzaveh, which we know has to do with building the Mishkan and everything connected to it, the Kelim, the Big Kahuna. And you have in Parshas Kisisa some additional things that are connected to the Mishkan, such as the Shemen HaMishcha, that's the special oil used to anoint the Kelim and the Mishkan, the Ketores, and the Kior that Kohanim used to wash. And then a little bit after that, talks about Bezalel, the architect, and his team, and what they were to make. And then comes, Hashem says to Moshe, Pasuk Yud Beis, again, Perek Lamed Aleph, the Atah, Daber Bnei Yisrael Lemor. So this is like introducing Shabbos with a certain sense of like really giving it publicity. You shall speak to Bnei Yisrael, saying, Ach es Shabbosai tishmoru. So now you really see Shabbos getting a certain prominence here. My Shabbosos you shall observe, and the Torah calls it for the first time an os, right? Ki os he beini u'beinechem dorosechem. Again, this is important because when we think about what emerges with regard to Shabbos at different junctures, it's here that the Torah begins to emphasize this idea of Shabbos being a sign between me and you for generations, to know that I'm Hashem who sanctified you. So this is something very interesting that we did not see in Aseres HaDibros, the idea of Shabbos being a sign. Ushmartem es Shabbos. Again, so far it's only mentioned in the positive, right? You shall observe my Shabbos. Again, it says Ushmartem es Shabbos ki kodesh yilachem. This idea of kodesh, Shabbos kodesh, is mentioned here. We'll have to see if we can find that elsewhere. We may actually find that before Matan Torah, that expression, Shabbos Kodesh. But here it says it again, Shabbos Kodesh, Ki Kodesh Yilachem. Something else that is mentioned here that we did not see before, and that is Mechalel Mos Yumas, the idea of Chilul Shabbos and the consequences of Chilul Shabbos being capital punishment. And repeating that again, Ki Osava Malacha V'Nichrisa. There's capital punishment through Beis Din, and there's also, you could say, capital punishment by Kares, that is the Misa B'dei Shamayim idea, which would mean if there were no witnesses, then it'd still be the punishment for someone who violates Shabbos willingly, B'Nichrisa, making obviously Shabbos very, very significant. The Torah continues with a lot more to say. Sheshes Yomim Ya'aseh Melacha. Here it says 6 days work shall be done. Uvayom Hashvi Shabbos Shabboson Kodesh Lashem. Again, the Kodesh idea, Shabbos Shabboson, and again the emphasis of the Onesh. Kol Osem Melacha B'Yom Hashem Mos Yumas. And the Torah is not finished. B'Shamu B'nei Yisrael Shabbos. We said before Shabbosai Tishmoru. We have Ushmartem as a Shabbos, and we have a third emphasis on Shmira. The Shamu B'nei Yisrael Shabbos, Lasos as a Shabbos L'Doro Sam. That's a word that we did see before, L'Doro Sechem. Bris Olam. Again, we had the word Os, now we have the word Bris. And again, the theme of Beini Uvein Bnei Israel, we had that earlier in the pasuk of Osi Beini Uveinechem. It is a bris between me and Bnei Israel. Osi, again, the word os, Ki Sheshes Yomim, and now the reason that we saw in Aseret HaDibros, this sums it up. We saw in Aseret HaDibros, but not quite highlighted in the unique way the Torah describes it over here in Parshas Ki Sisa. It is for 6 days Hashem created the world. Okay, so here is a very important section, probably even in certain sense raising Shabbos to even more elevated description of its uniqueness. Here, even more than Aseret HaDibros, adding the element of the Onesh. This is mentioned in connection to the Mishkan when Hashem is giving Moshe, after everything else that he said about the Mishkan, Hashem says to Moshe about Shabbos that he, Moshe, should tell this to Bnei Israel, Daber Bnei Israel. Now, let's go a little further in the same parasha Ki Sisa, and we'll go to a little bit toward the end of the parasha, and you look at Perek Lamed Dalet, Pasuk Chaf Aleph. Now here, it's just a one pasuk mention, which was similar to Parshas Mishpatim, if you recall. Right? Parshas Mishpatim had many mitzvos, mentioned Shemitah, and it mentioned Shabbos in one pasuk. Here again in Ki Sisa, Sheshes Yomim Tavod, one pasuk mentioning it here, Ubayom Hashvi Tishbos, you shall rest. And here it highlights two of the malachos. B'chor sheba kartzir tishbos. Charisha is plowing, and Katsira is harvesting, you shall rest. Again, all of these things can have many commentaries in the Gemara and Drashos and so on, but just for our purposes, just to get our feet wet, so to speak, one pasuk mention. The context of this pasuk is a lot of other mitzvos that Hashem is telling Moshe about in the wake of Chet HaEgel. Remember, there was a Chet HaEgel intervening earlier in the parsha, right after the mention of Shabbos that we went through, B'Shem Uvnei Yisrael Shabbos, that ended at Sheni. You have the long story of Chet HaEgel, and now you could say Hashem is trying to reiterate some of the mitzvos that have been mentioned back when, after Matan Torah the first time, and that's what you'll find quite an overlap. If you will look on your own at the psukim that here appear toward the end of Ki Sisa, you will notice, just to give you one interesting example, the pasuk Chavav in the same section that we're at right now, which is the last pasuk in the series of psukim of mitzvos, Reishis Bikuri Ad Mascha, the beginning, the first of your ripened fruit of your ground, Tali Beis Hashem Elkecha, you shall bring to the Beis Hamikdash, that's Bikurim. Do not cook a kid in the mother's milk. Those exact words, literally word for word, you will find back where in Parshas Mishpatim, at the end of the series of mitzvahs that you'll find there. If you would look back for a second, Chav Gimel Yutes, you'll see literally the same exact pasuk twice. And it's really there a third time in Chumash, but for now, Mishpatim and Ki Sisa have a lot of overlap. And you'll see other things as well. The Shalosh Regalim are in both places, and so we have Shabbos mentioned in both places. The one reference, the one pasuk reference, both in Mishpatim and in Ki Sisa, toward the end of Ki Sisa. Again, the earlier part of Ki Sisa, there's a lot more the Torah describes regarding the Kiddush of Shabbos, the Os of Shabbos, the Onesh of Shabbos. Let's proceed further. We're still in Sefer Shmos. We still have to get through Vayikra Bamidbar Dvarim. Beginning of Vayakhel. Where are we right now in history? Vayakhel Moshe. Moshe Rabbeinu has now descended from Har Sinai at the end of Ki Sisa with the second Luchos. Right? Hashem has forgiven Bnei Yisrael on Yom Kippur for the Chet HaEgel. Moshe Rabbeinu descends from Har Sinai. He gathers everybody, and he's going to give them instructions about building the Mishkan. But before he does that, and he tells them all the things that need to be collected for, and everyone is very enthusiastic and comes and brings what they have to bring, just before that, this is Moshe Rabbeinu saying the following. Two psukim in the beginning of Vayakhel, Lamed Hey Beis, Lamed Hey Gimel. Sheshes Yamim Te'asa Melacha, Uvayom Hashvi Yorachem Kodesh. The word Kodesh we saw before. Shabbos Shabboson, we saw that before. Shabbos Hashem, Kol Osav V'Lecha, you must. We've seen that before as well. In other words, what we had in the beginning of Kisisa, when Hashem said to Moshe to speak to Bnei Yisrael, and all of those psukim there, this is that the Torah tells us here, the Torah that Moshe is doing. The Torah doesn't go through all those other things that are mentioned in Kisisa about the idea that it's an os and it's Beini Vein Bnei Yisrael. Certainly Moshe gave that over, but that's not what the Torah actually spells out. It's possible, Rabbeinu Bechaya points out, that it's possible that some of those special esoteric ideas of Shabbos, Moshe chose to say only to certain select individual Jews, but not everybody. Since this is a gathering of everybody, Moshe kept it down to the bare bones basics, which is what you have in these psukim, having to do with the Onesh itself, Shabbos Shabboson, but all those other ideas that we saw in Kisisa that Hashem said that the Moshe should tell, that Moshe reserved to tell to only the elite and not necessarily to the masses. One more pasuk here that should be noticed. Lo sevaru eish b'chol moshe b'yom Shabbos. Moshe chose to mention specifically the malacha of havara. One of the lamdas malachos is havara, to light, make a fire wherever you might be. That is forbidden. We know that there's an Isser Malacha, and the Torah usually just leaves it at that. Lo sasachol malacha, and we break it down. We have a Masorah, how many malachas there are. But here you have specifically Lo sevaru eish mentioned as an individual specific Isser, and that has to be explained in different interpretations why the Torah singled out Havara, not for us right now. Okay, that takes us now to the next Sefer in Chumash. This is more or less Shabbos, not more or less. This is Shabbos from Matan Torah and on. Okay, we haven't gone back to before Yisro. We saw Yisro, Tzedibros, we saw Mishpatim, we saw Kisisa beginning to Kisisa at the end, and we have Vayakel in the beginning. Okay, let's go to Sefer Vayikra. Sefer Vayikra does not have mention of Shabbos in the earlier parshas. Vayikra, Tzav, Shmini, these are about Karbanos, Kashrus, Tasriya Mitzoris, about Saras, Tuma Vetara, Achrimos, still no mention of Shabbos. The first mention of Shabbos in Sefer Vayikra is found in Parshas Kedoshim, and it's found not once but twice. Each time it's just a couple of words, and it's juxtaposed with something else, which is something to take note of. Beginning of Parshas Kedoshim, Yud Tes Gimel. Parshas Kedoshim, of course, is very important because it's one of those things that the Torah wanted Moshe to teach to Kol Adas B'nai Yisrael. Again, the idea of Hakel. Everybody should be present. So it starts with Kedoshim Tiyu, which is a very important meta mitzvah. The idea of being Kadosh, Ki Kadosh Hashem Elokechem. And right after that, the second thing that's mentioned after that is Ish Imo V'aviv Tirau, fearing your parents. The Es Shabsosai Tishmoru, and you shall observe my Shabbos. So Ani Hashem Elokechem. So that is the beginning of Kedoshim. A little later on in Kedoshim has many, many mitzvahs, of course, but you'll see literally the same identical connection, the juxtaposition of Shabbos together with the Migdash. Perek Yud Tes, Pasuk Lamed. Again, we're still in Kedoshim, in Vayikra. Es Shabsosai Tishmoru, Umikdashi Tirau, Ani Hashem. It's not, I should correct myself, it's not Kibur, it's not Mora Aveim, it's Mikdashi Tirau, but it's together with another mitzvah. In the beginning, it's together with the mitzvah of fearing our parents, and Shabsosai Tishmoru juxtaposed with fearing one's parents. Here, it's Shabsosai Tishmoru mentioned first, and followed by Mikdashi Tirau, with fear not of parents, but fear of the Migdash. That pasuk, interestingly enough, will appear again in the Parshas Bahar, which we'll soon get to. Before we get to that pasuk in Parshas Bahar, though, we have two references to Shabbos in Parshas Emor. So what we saw in Kedoshim were two psukim, each one just 3 words, Shabsosai Tishmoru, together with something else. Parshas Emor, the second half of the parsha, talks about the cycle of the Moadim, beginning with Perek Chav Gimel, And the cycle of the Moedim takes us through the calendar, beginning with Pesach, and then you have the period of Spiras Omer and the Karbanos brought for the second day of Pesach, the Omer, and it goes on to Shavuos. From there, it goes on to Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, Sukkot, Shmini Atzeres, and of course the famous pasuk David Moshe's Moed Hashem of Bnei Yisrael. But what is interesting is before he begins to even talk about the Moedim, which is beginning with Pesach, the Torah mentions one pasuk, which is pasuk Gimel, right? After saying David Bnei Yisrael v'matam Moed Hashem asher tikvos amikrei kodesh, then we have the one pasuk here, Sheishes Yamim Te'asim Elacha, v'Yom HaShvi Shabbos Shabbosam Mikra Kodesh. Shabbos is here called seemingly Mikra Kodesh. Kol Melacha Lo Sasu, you shall not do work. Shabbos Yishem Chamosh V'Seichem, and from there we go on to Moed Hashem. So think about, not every question will we answer, but the Torah makes sure to insert Shabbos before it even goes to go through the cycle of the Moedim, which we have starting with the next pasuk, pasuk Dalet. So that's mentioned, tucked away in Parshas Emor. And now we have another reference to Shabbos in Parshas Emor toward the end. Perek Chav Dalet. Now, this mention of Shabbos is specific to something that was done in the Beis HaMikdash every Shabbos. One of the kelim in the Beis HaMikdash that was inside the covered area that we call the Heichal was known as the Shulchan. What was unique about the Shulchan? You had on it 12 stacks of what we call Lechem HaPanim. The Lechem HaPanim, this was actually not chametz, it was unleavened. There were 12 stacks, 6 and 6, and they were arranged on the Shulchan, and they would stay on the Shulchan for over a week, or for a week, you could say, from one Shabbos to the other. When Shabbos would come, the old Lechem HaPanim would be removed, and the new Lechem HaPanim would be placed there, and that would remain till the following week. The Lechem HaPanim that was removed would be divided up between the two shifts of Kohanim, the ones that were finishing their shift from the previous week, and the new shift that was coming in. And the Torah stresses here the idea of Lechem HaPanim, how it would be made, 12 chalos, and how much flour went into each challah, and you would set it up with 2 stacks of 6, and look at Pasuk Ches. There was a spoonful of levona, which is frankincense, that would be right next to or on top of the stacks of bread. That would be burnt on the Mizbeach, and that would serve to permit the Lechem HaPanim to be eaten. It says the Pasuk in Pasuk Ches, B'yom HaShabbos, meaning each Shabbos, Yarchenu Lifnei Hashem Tamid. So this is not so much Melacha of Shabbos, not so much the uniqueness of Shabbos in terms of its being a sign or the Kedusha. It has to do with the way that the Torah has the mitzvah of Lechem HaPanim being fulfilled. It would be arranged each Shabbos, Bris Olam, and it would be for the Aaron Ubanov to eat. One more mention of mitzvah of Shabbos of the week in Parshas Bahar. Now, Bahar B'chul Kosei, of course, talk about Shemitah, which is the Shabbos of the years, but not so much Shabbos as the day of the week. But there is one pasuk at the end of Bahar that we've already seen the exact language appearing in Parshas Kedoshim, the very last pasuk of Bahar, and that is Chavav Beis. Again, one of those interesting things where you see that they decided to end Parshas, to have the last 2 psukim Parshas Bahar be a new perek. Don't ask me why, and begin B'chul Kosei with pasuk Gimel, which again does not make any sense. As you can see, it's all connected, and then you have a pay, which is a break, beginning Parshas B'chul Kosei. But for whatever reason, for our purposes, Chavav Beis, the last pasuk of Bahar, the same words that we saw before in Kedoshim, the second reference in Kedoshim, Shabsosai Tishmoru Mikdashi Tiro Ani Hashem. Again, every one of these references, you can do your homework and try to do analysis when the Mefarshim, what's it doing here? Why is it here? There's got to be a reason for every reference. This, I don't know that we'll be able to get to. But I just want everyone to appreciate every reference in Chumash to Shabbos. That ends Sefer Vayikra. Okay, so to review Vayikra, where did we have the first reference in Vayikra? We had it in Parashas Kedoshim, in the beginning in connection to the fear of your parents, and again later in connection to Mikdashi Tibra'u. Then we had Emor in connection to the cycle of the Moadim. The Torah starts with Shabbos. And then you have at the end of Emor with Lechem Aponim. And now we have the one pasuk at the end of Bahar, which is the same exact language as we found in the second reference to Kedoshim, in Kedoshim. Sefer Bamidbar, there is one reference to Shabbos, and that's in specifically regarding a story. And the story is really an application of one of the aspects of Shabbos that we saw already in Kisisa and Vayakel. We noticed in Parshas Kisisa and Vayakel that the Torah says if you do melacha on Shabbos, there's a penalty. There's a capital punishment associated. The Torah says in Kisisa it says you must, and also again in Parshas Vayakel, Kosova Melacha you must. Most you must. The story at the end of Parshas Shalach, Tes Vav Lamed Beis. Again, this whole story is all of 3 psukim, tucked away at the end of Shalach. Again, why it's here, maybe we'll have to get to it at some point. Vayu b'nei Yisrael b'midbar. Now, this in chronologically in Chumash, this is after Chet HaMeraglin, after there was already a decree not to enter Eretz Yisrael. This story may or may not have occurred in the juncture where it is positioned in Chumash. I hope at some point along the series we'll be able to analyze the story more carefully. They were in the Midbar Vayimtzu, and they found a man, Mikoshesh Eitzim B'Yom Shabbos. Ish Mikoshesh Eitzim, he was doing something which clearly would have seemed to be a malacha. Exactly what the malacha was is a discussion. He was gathering wood. Vayakrivu saw Moshe Mikoshesh Eitzim. The people who saw him doing it brought him to Moshe and Aaron and the Sanhedrin, a Kol HaEdah. And Vainicho Soba Mishmar, they put him in a prison because they didn't know what to do. That's the 3 psukim. And then let's go to the next 2 psukim that give you the verdict. So it's really a total of 5 psukim here that discuss the story. Hashem said to Moshe, the penalty is he shall be put to death, specifically through stoning. And so they did that. They took him out of the camp. So here you have the story of Mikoshesh Eitzim, who he was, a lot to be said about why he did it, and why didn't they know what the punishment was? Didn't we already hear about that? Again, possibly they knew he was Chayav Misa, but not which Misa, maybe something else. That is Parshas Shalach. Again, just to lay the groundwork for some other point we'll come back to. Okay, the last reference is in Sefer Dvarim, and this really is it. So this is the completeness of from Matan Torah and on. And this everyone can guess already where we're looking. We have Aseres HaDibros in Yisro, and we have Aseres HaDibros a second time in Sefer Dvarim, which is V'eschanan. So we have in V'eschanan, the 4th of the Aseres HaDibros, Hey, Yud Beis through Tes Vav. And here you will notice quite a number of differences between the language used of Aseres HaDibros for Shabbos in V'eschanan, in contrast to how the Torah presents Shabbos in Yisro. The most obvious and most striking that people immediately are aware of from L'chadodi is the first word. In Yisro, it begins Zachor es Yom HaShabbos HaKadisho. Here, it's Shamor es Yom HaShabbos HaKadisho. Chazal say they were B'dibur Echad. But there's much more to notice, much more. Notice, first of all, after the word L'kadsho, the Torah says 4 more words in this pasuk, and we will return to this shortly. Kasher tzivcha Hashem Elokecha, as Hashem has commanded you. That's interesting. Of course, Hashem has commanded you. What does He have to say? Kasher tzivcha. What does the Aseres HaDibros have to say? Now, this, truthfully, it's a bit of a question in the Mefarshim. Are these words the words that appear on the Luchos? Or are these words the words that Moshe Rabbeinu is communicating verbally when he's going over the Torah? Or is it both? In other words, the words that Moshe Rabbeinu is using to tell over Aseres HaDibros are the words of the Luchos. When I say the words of the Luchos, it would have to mean not the first Luchos, but the second Luchos. Many Mefarshim assume that the discrepancies between Parshas Yisro's version, this coming week's Parsha of Aseres HaDibros, and what you have in Beschanan correspond to Luchos Rishonos and Luchos Shnios. Luchos Rishonos, which of course never made it to us, they broke. They were broken by Moshe. That is what you had in Parshas Yisro on the Luchos Rishonos, which Hashem gave Moshe everything. And the second Luchos, Moshe Rabbeinu had to bring his own psalacha. He carved out the stone. Hashem wrote on it what was on the first Luchos, but not exactly. That's where these words would be appearing on the second Luchos. Either way, Kasher Tzivcha Hashem Elokecha, that's another thing to notice. And again, you notice a number of Shinuyim language changes in what comes here. Again, similar but somewhat different. That we didn't have before. And here other words, so they shall rest as well. But perhaps the most interesting of some of the differences is the reason the Torah sums it up with. In Parshas Yisro, the last pasuk that gives the reason for Shabbos is Zecher L'Maseh V'Reishis. In Parshas Veschanan, the Torah concludes the mitzvah of Shabbos with V'Zachar to give Yisrael Mitzrayim. You remember you were a slave. Hashem took you out. Al Kain Sivcha Hashem Yom Shabbos. So the Al Kain of Parshas Yisro was Al Kain Beirach Hashem Es Yom Shabbos Kadeshehu, because he rested on the seventh day. The Al Kain Sivcha of Parshas Veschanan is connecting to Yitzias Mitzrayim. Again, many of these diukim that I mentioned, we will not get to, but you need my Makomos. I can try to provide you them, and you can certainly delve into them and find wonderful insights and ideas. What I just wanted to do with you the last half hour was simply show you the range of where you find Shabbos in Chumash, beginning with Yisro through the end of the Torah. This is the last reference to Shabbos in the Torah in Veschanan. Okay, so Sefer Dvarim, it's only one reference in Veschanan. In Sefer Bamidbar, it's the one reference in Parshas Shalach with Mikoshesh Eitzim. In Vayikra, going backwards, we had the pasuk at the end of Bahar. We had Emor with Lechem Apanim, and earlier with the Moadim. In Kedoshim, we had the one pasuk in the beginning and the one pasuk in the middle. And back in Sefer Shmos, we had Vayakel, we had twice in Kisisa, we had in Mishpatim, and of course Yisro. This is where you have it from Matan Torah. But we're going to go back even before that, because in fact, Matan Torah, Aseret Adibros, was not the first time that Shabbos was presented to Klal Yisrael. There were two junctures before Matan Torah, and here we're going back to last week's parasha, B'Shalach, where apparently Shabbos was presented to Klal Yisrael. Now, if you look in Psukim, Chumash, without any Mefarshim, you will immediately notice one of those two places, and that is the story of the man. So if you take a look with me in Parshas B'Shalach, beginning with Perek Tezayin, which talks about Bnei Yisrael journeying from a place called Elim, where they had the 70 palms and springs, 12 springs, and they find their way, it tells us, to Midbar Sin, which is between Elim and Sinai, and the date is given in the Pasuk, in Pasuk Aleph, here, Tezayin Aleph, on the 15th of the second month to their leaving. Bnei Yisrael begin to complain, and they say, we can't manage here. We wish we could have died in Mitzrayim. We don't have what to eat. And that's where Hashem tells Moshe in Pasuk Daled, I'm going to make it rain down from heaven with lechem, which is what we know is the man. They shall go out and gather each day the portion of man in order that I can test them if they'll follow my mitzvos. Continues the next Pasuk, Pasuk Hey, it shall be on Yom HaShishi. On the sixth day, they shall prepare what they will be bringing, and it shall be a double portion. Now, we know that it was on the 15th of the month that they arrived. We haven't identified the day of the week, but the Gemara does. The Gemara says that was on the Shabbos. So if you follow that chronology, you can therefore extrapolate that the Yom HaShishi that followed would be, if Shabbos was 15th, the following Shabbos would be the 22nd of the second month. The Friday before that, the day before, would be the 21st of the second month. So that shall be the day, Hashem says that there'll be Lechem Mishnah. So Moshe and Aaron tell Bnei Israel, you'll see, you'll be getting meat at night, you'll be getting bread by day, everything will be good. Don't complain. Let's go on a few psukim. Pasuk Yud Aleph, Pasuk Yud Beis, Hashem says to Moshe, I've heard their complaints, tell them they're going to get their meat at night, they're going to get their bread in the daytime. And so it was, by evening they had the slav, in the morning there was a layer of dew that covered the camp, it was lifted, and it was this description of this very subtle, very unique type of a food. The Bnei Israel looked at it, they said it is manhu. Man means some kind of a preparation of food. They didn't know what to call it. Moshe said, that's the bread. And Moshe gives them the instructions, gather it, everyone, according to what they can eat. It will be an omer per person, per head. You'll gather for everyone in your tent, for your family members, and so they did. And it would turn out everyone got exactly that measure. This is all the basic lessons of the man. Now, meanwhile, Moshe told them not to leave over. There were some people who disregarded Moshe, and in fact, they did leave over, and it got wormy and spoiled. They continued to gather man each day, and it would, whatever would be left on the field would melt. That's Pasuk Chaf Aleph. Comes Pasuk Chaf Beis, and here we begin to read about Shabbos again. On the sixth day, remember Hashem had told Moshe earlier on, there's going to be Lechem Mishnah, so it was. Again, we identified the day as the 21st of Iyar. On the sixth day, they gathered double man, 2 omer per person. The Nesir Ha'eda, the princes, come to Moshe, and apparently they're puzzled. They Yagidu Moshe, look at this, double man. Moshe says, Hu Hashadiber Hashem, that's what Hashem had told me, Shabbason, Shabbos Kodesh, Hashem Machar. Now notice, we went through all those references before. To Shabbos, we noted the expression Shabbos Kodesh, especially appearing in Parshas Kisisa, but notice it's already here in Parshas Beshalach. Moshe says, this is Shabbos Kodesh LaHashem Machar. That's why there's double man today. What you need to bake, you'll bake today. What you need to cook, you'll cook today, which seems to imply you're not going to cook or bake tomorrow. So there's some element of Shabbos that's being presented right now in connection to the man, the idea of preparing on Friday for Shabbos. Apparently that means not to do the cooking on Shabbos itself. Whatever is left, leave over. And the question, of course, we should also wonder about is why didn't they know that this was coming? Didn't Hashem tell Moshe that there's going to be the Lechem Mishnah on Friday? But so it is. Moshe says that's what Hashem said. And so they observed that and they left it till the morning and it did not spoil. And Moshe said in Pasuk Chafei, eat it today. It is Shabbos. You will not find it on the field. Gather for 6 days. On Shabbos, you won't have it. And so what happened next? Moshe said, gather for 6 days, right? What happened? On the 7th day, people went to gather man. Hashem was critical. Yom Hashem Moshe ad ana me'antem. Why have you refused to observe my mitzvahs? And now, Pasuk Chavtes, you might have thought this is still Hashem speaking, but on further analysis, it doesn't sound that way. Ru'u ki Hashem nasan lachem haShabbos. So who is talking? Apparently, this is now Moshe speaking and telling them, look, Hashem has given you a Shabbos, and that is why he has given you double portion on the 6th day. Everyone stay put. Do not leave your place. And this is another aspect of Shabbos that may refer to the inyan of Tchumin, not to go beyond certain bounds, which again, whatever that means, midoraisa, that might exist. Either way, Moshe is telling them more about Shabbos, and in fact, so we have the Bnei Israel resting on the 7th day in connection to the man. And then the rest of the section is more related to the man itself. But meanwhile, we've noticed a lot here in the story of the man that has already presented Shabbos to Bnei Israel as some special day, a Shabbos Kodesh, the idea of preparing on Friday for Shabbos, the inference that they should not be cooking or baking on Shabbos, the idea of staying in one place and not going away from where they are. All this already precedes Matan Torah. And that's obviously from the psukim that we can gather that. And that is begging the question, so what existed in terms of Shabbos as a mitzvah right here in connection to the month. We haven't identified the exact place. We know it's in Midbar Sin, but maybe for next week we'll get more specific. And then, of course, we get Shabbos as part of Aseret Dibros. But I want to go back even before this. This, you won't sense it directly in the psukim explicitly, but it's through a Chazal's tradition that we assume that Shabbos was already given to Bnei Yisrael before even the story of the man. And what am I referring to? So go back in the Shalach a bit earlier. We picked up from Chamishi when they journeyed, or from Tazayin when they journeyed from Elim, and they went to Midbar Sin. Let's go backwards a little bit. Before this, they were in Elim, which is where they had the 12 springs and the 70 palm trees. Let's go back before that, and we'll notice 5 psukim. This is Tezvav Chav Beis through Tezvav Chav Vav. These 5 psukim are very significant for our purposes. Okay, these 5 psukim that we had last Shabbos in the parsha appear right after Shiras Hayam. Moshe Bnei Yisrael sang Az Yashir, Miriam, and the women sang Shiru Hashem Ki Ga'ol Ga'ah. And then the Torah goes back to a narrative. And we have Pasuk Chabeis describing how Moshe had Bnei Yisrael journey from Yam Suf into Midbar Shur. They traveled for 3 days in the desert without finding water. The next pasuk says they came to Mara and they were unable to drink the water there because it was bitter, and therefore they named the place Mara, which means bitter. The third pasuk says the people complained, "What are we drinking?" The fourth of the 5 psukim says that Moshe cried out to Hashem, and Hashem showed Moshe some kind of a tree, a wood, which he threw into the water, and the water turned sweet. And then we get to these last words of the pasuk that are very significant. Sham lo choku mishpat. There he placed before him a system of laws, a statute and laws. V'sham nisau, and there he tested them. Very ambiguous phrases. Something happened in Mara that you could call chok u'mishpat, and some kind of a test occurred as well. And the final of the 5 psukim says, Hashem said, or Moshe said, Im shamoa tishmel kol Hashem elokecha, if you will listen carefully to Hashem says, Vayasher be'einav ta'aseh, you'll do what is just in his eyes. Vazantel mitzvot, you pay close attention to his mitzvot and observe his statutes. Obviously, the idea that there were statutes that were given here and maybe more to come, I guarantee you, all the illnesses that I placed against Mitzrayim connected to the Makos, you will not have to experience any of that because I am Hashem, your healer. Very important psukim, the idea of something in Mara with water that was bitter that became sweet, but in addition, something having to do with laws that were given as well. Again, we wouldn't know from reading the psukim what type of laws, what type of mitzvos, what exactly was introduced. But we have a tradition that Chazal tell us that there were a series of mitzvos that they received in Mara. Chazal identify dinim, meaning the laws, many of them are Parshas Mishpatim related, of setting up the societies and paying for damages and things like that. We have Kibbut Aveim as a mitzvah mentioned by Chazal that they were given in Mara. We have possibly one source in the Medrash of the Parah Aduma. Maybe that's why the word chok could refer to it. And we have, for our purposes, the mitzvah of Shabbos. And I want to just show you one of the ways of Chazal know that Shabbos was given in Mara. If we go back to Parshas Va'eschanan, and we noted before that there were 4 words mentioned at the end of the pasuk that mentions Shomer Yom HaShabbos L'Kadisho. And those were the 4 words, Kasher Tzivcha Hashem Elokecha, as Hashem has commanded you. And we wondered, why does the Torah add those 4 words? You'll also notice that those same 4 words appear again a few psukim later in connection to Kabbalas Avicha Vesimecha. The first Aseret Dibros don't have those additional words, but here in Veschanan, you have it again, Kasher Tzivcha Hashem Elokecha. Chazal say, in 3 places in Gemara, and Rashi quotes both over here, that Kashet Tzivcha Hashem Elokecha means the following: observe Shabbos as I've previously commanded you before Matan Torah. Where? In Mara. This is the Kashet Tzivcha of Shabbos and also the Kashet Tzivcha of Kibbur Avayim. So what we end up saying is that Shabbos was given in Mara. Shabbos was given in Mara as the mitzvah of Shabbos. Shabbos apparently also made its appearance in connection to the man. And then, of course, we have a Seres HaDibros and on and everything else that we saw. And so I leave you with more or less the question that we'll begin to ponder starting next week, exactly what changed from Mara to the story of the man, which we'll give it a name right now. We'll call it Alush. And the reason I'm giving you that name is because Chazal assumed that the place where the man began to fall was Alush. Where did Chazal get the name Alush? Because if you look in Parshas Maseh, in the beginning of Parshas Maseh, which talks about the various places that Bnei Yisrael were stopping in the Midbar. So you look in Parshas Maseh, which is Sefer Bamidbar Lamed Gimel, you will notice Pasuk Yud Beis Yud Gimel Yud Dalet. So you'll see in Pasuk Yud Beis, Vayisu mibasin vayachnu b'dafka, Vayisu midafka in Pasuk Yud Gimel vayachnu ba'alush, and then Vayisu me'alush vayachnu b'refidim, and that's where they had no water. Now, if you go back to Beshalach, you'll see that right after the story of the man, it talks about journeying on, and they find their way to Refidim. So the stop before Refidim, as you see here, was Alush. So Chazal say that the place where the man was falling was Alush, Aleph Lamed Vav Shin. So we've identified Mara as one stop before Matan Torah, before Sinai, that Shabbos was given. We have now Alush, which is the place where the man began to fall, and again, the hearing about Shabbos. And then we have, of course, Sinai and on. I leave you with the following question, and then we'll begin to delve into what we can possibly say. The question of the week, okay, is the following. And it's something that you'll find this question not just in Chumash, but in Mefarshim on the Haggadah. The Haggadah has a very famous poem that we all know about, and we sing it, that has a refrain of Dayenu. Dayenu has 15 levels, 15 malos, right? Like the Shira Malos in Tehillim. The 10th one of the 15. Ilu hachilanu es haman, v'lo nasan lanu es haShabbos Dayenu. If you would have given us the man and not given us Shabbos, that would have been enough. So the question that you'll find the Mefarshim asking is, seemingly, if we have a tradition that Shabbos was given in Mara, and Mara we saw happen before the man, that was Mara, then there was Elim, then they journeyed to Midbar Sin, and they find their way to Alush, and then Refidim, and then Sinai. But obviously, Mara was earlier, so why do we talk about the man and then Shabbos? We should have put Shabbos earlier, because Shabbos came before the man. That is a question that is worthy of an answer, that has to try to discuss the nuances of what could have been unique with the man that Shabbos didn't yet have until then, even though there was some giving of Shabbos that came earlier. That will be the question of the week that we'll pick up with next week. But at least now, Baruch Hashem, I hope you have an idea of, someone will ask you, where can I find the mitzvah of Shabbos in Chumash? We're not talking about Navi, that's its own issues. Yirmiyahu and other places, and many Sfarim in Nach. But where can you find Shabbos in Chumash? I think we were able to identify all those places. Hopefully you can retain that information. And then you can begin to look more carefully at each of those sources and see why the Torah mentions Shabbos in those particular places. How is it connected to the context in which it appears? But what we'll try to do is go back to before Matan Torah and work our way from there to Matan Torah and try to figure out what could have been the various aspects of Shabbos that emerge at the different points in the Torah where Klal Yisrael are introduced to Shabbos. And with that, we'll wish everyone a good week. Good Tvach. Yetzer Hashem will continue next time.
Thank you so much. Have a
Welcome.
good week.
Okay.